A negotiation training exercise. A 6'2" ex-military man stands up, leans over a 5'1" woman trying to intimidate her. She doesn't flinch. When Rebecca Oldfield watched the playback, she had a revelation. I'm much stronger than I think I am. I don't need to be afraid of these people anymore. That moment transformed a scientist into a leader who champions kindness as a competitive advantage. Rebecca's journey from PhD to C-suite proves that staying calm when someone tries to intimidate you isn't a weakness, it's power. I'm Penny Triantafillou, and this is Women Leaders, Tales, Trails, and Truths. Rebecca, thank you so much for being here with us in the beautiful National Automotive Innovation Centre on campus. You won that prestigious Kindness and Leadership Award in 2023, which we're going to talk about, but I want to start 10 years earlier if we can. Take us back to that negotiation training room. So set the scene for me. What did the room look like? Who else was there?
Well, thank you very much for having me, Penny. It's great to be here. Lovely to meet you after all this time. So it was 10 years ago, and I should say that it was a fantastic training course, a three days residential course, and there were about 7 of us on the training course, and our wonderful trainer Mark, who I've stayed in touch with all this time. It was I remember it was a fairly bland room, and one of the first times I'd probably been videoed doing anything. It wasn't so common back then, but the training really built up. So by the time we got to this part, it was a full-on 3-on-3 negotiation. So 3 of us on one side of the table, 3 on the other side, with the lead negotiator sitting in the middle. So I was the lead on my side, and this chap was the lead on the other side. I should give a disclaimer that he was a very nice chap actually, but the exercise was to win the negotiation. So I was flanked by these 2 supporters, as was he, and our job was to negotiate a deal. And it got more and more heated over time. And as you said, eventually I think I frustrated him so much by not budging and staying calm that he actually got out of his seat and leant right over me. And at the time, I hadn't really noticed what that looked like. But as you said, when we watched the playback afterwards, it was quite a strange situation to see just how much bigger he was than me sitting in my seat.
So what was, when he first stood up and leaned over you, what was your immediate thought? Not when, in hindsight, when you watched the playback, what was going through your mind?
Well, actually, I found it quite exciting. I found myself thinking, okay, this is getting interesting. And in some ways, I think the adrenaline kicked in at that point. And what I noticed in the video playback is that I actually just leant forward a little bit, almost went towards him rather than away from him. And I do remember thinking, this is quite good fun, actually.
So you were enjoying it?
I was, yeah.
What stopped you from backing down, do you think? I mean, I love that little movement that you did, moving forward, like meeting him almost. I suppose, if I'm honest, I guess there's a competitive spirit in me, and I didn't want him to get the better of me at the time, or his team. I mean, it was set up as a competition. Who's gonna get the best deal out of this negotiation. Right. So the vibe in the room was kind of like, this is a competition. Let's see who's gonna win.
Although, our Mark was at pains to, of course, point out that the best negotiations are the ones where everyone thinks that they've won. So, but yes, that was the way it was set up, and we'd agreed our strategy and what we wanted to get out of the negotiation. So, I was minded to get what we'd gone in for.
That's brilliant. I love that. So, how did you show up differently after that?
I I think probably, you know, standing a bit taller, shoulders back a little bit more, just that sense of, you know, you start to appreciate about yourself the things that you know are an advantage. We've all got strengths and weaknesses, and I think through life, it's a constant journey of learning what you're good at and what you're not so good at, and trying to play to your strengths and mitigate the impact of your weaknesses. So I guess it was just feeling stronger in the knowledge that I had that kind of inner resilience.
Can you think of another example of when you kind of used that knowledge?
Well, I would say there have been, you know, quite a few negotiations in the last 10 years of all different types, particularly when I was in a commercial role and having some tricky conversations with customers. I think just reminding myself of that, taking that moment to breathe, suspend judgment, stay calm. So it has been very useful in a number of situations.
Oh, I'm sure. That sounds fantastic. So that revelation, I'm so much stronger than I think I am, has been something that has almost been a catalyst, very powerful. I'm curious about the timing, because that negotiation training exercise happened, what, 10, 12 years ago? Mm-hmm. And around that same time, you went through leadership training that, as you mentioned in the LinkedIn post, completely reframed my understanding of leadership. So let's talk about that for a second. So what was your understanding of leadership before the course?
So I've worked my whole career in a large organisation, and I would say I would call it a corporate environment. And up until that point, most of the leaders that I had seen and very much admired had all been in a particular mould, I would say, and I would call it strong, controlled, calm, often male. In fact, mostly men had been my experience up until that point. And so that was my view of what leaders looked like: resilient under pressure, always strong, and I'm going to say at times a little bit detached or unemotional. So you can't have both at the same time, really. So that very cool, calm, collected, but at the same time perhaps a little bit distant, and generally knowing a lot. You know, that sense of people who kind of know the answer to everything. So that was my view. And when I went to this particular, it was a three-week residential training course, there was so much focus on humanity and kindness and connection that was a bit of a juxtaposition with my view of that slightly detached version of leadership. And so it really caused me to think, oh, actually, is there a different way? And I really enjoyed sort of leaning into that concept that, well, maybe there are different ways of leading, and none is right or wrong, but here's an alternative way, which I found spoke more to who I thought I was at the time.
So it just kind of resonated more with you. You didn't have to be this detached, kind of distant person. You could lead with kindness.
Yeah. It's not just kindness to others, it's kindness to yourself.
Oh, I love that. Tell me
well.
more.
Yeah. So in my experience up until that point, many of the leaders that I had come across, wonderful people, also fell into that mold of the kind of people who only need 4 hours sleep a night and who can get off an overnight flight from the States, come in and do a full day's work in the office. You know, whereas I used to get off those flights and want to kind of crawl under my duvet for 48 hours. And so it was this sense of, you know, you've got to keep sort of battling through. And one of the things that really opened my eyes on this course was this sense of, you've got to look after yourself first. Because if you are not the best version of yourself, if you're not kind to yourself, you're not going to be in the best position to lead others, to make good decisions. So much of the focus was on mental wellness, physical exercise, meditation, good eating, control of emotions, you know, how to stay calm and things. So I'd never really experienced that before of actually I've really got to work on myself and master my own body and my own mind to be the best leader I can be.
Sounds like it really was something that impacted you and then changed the way you looked at things.
Yeah, I think it's so obvious when you think about it, but it's I've since, you know, read quite a lot about this, and I like the analogy of the corporate athlete. I mean, if you're training to do the 100 meters, you don't just run the 100 meters all the time. You spend so much of your time training to do that, looking after your body, making sure that you sleep, that you eat, that you know, and you're not just training the few muscles that you need for the 100 meters. And it was a similar concept that you've got to, you know, when you show up as a leader and you're making decisions, you're leading by example, it's all built on a foundation of mental, physical and emotional resilience. So you've actually got to invest in that first.
I agree 100%. But your professor taught you also to put purpose and profit together, and that became your philosophy in a way. Can you give me a specific moment when you saw that principle work in your career?
Yeah, I mean, not long after that, we did something at Infineum where I work, which caused an awful lot of excitement and energy. And it was a sort of an innovation hackathon. So we asked all the people inside our organisation for opportunities that they thought we could invest in, work on, that would create some form of good in the world, but also create profit for the organisation. And I was just absolutely overwhelmed with what came out from that exercise. And we're still actually working on one of those ventures even
That's
today.
Incredible.
And what you really see is that when people come alive is when they believe they are making a difference and creating wealth that can be reinvested in making a difference somewhere else. So I really saw that when we gave our employees the opportunity to follow what they felt was their purpose and also create value for customers for Infineum, it was a sort of an explosive combination, and so you can't always achieve it, but I think if it becomes your philosophy, it can guide you to the right places at the right time.
Yes, sure sounds like it. Has there ever been a time when purpose and profit felt at odds?
I think it's easy to come unstuck. I will put it that way, and I think where that tends to happen is where you get stuck between short term and long term. Sometimes purpose tends to be more of a long term ambition and mission, and we all work for organisations where we have shareholders, investors, and sometimes we need to think about the short-term profitability. But I would say that, you know, the world is not black and white, so you can't always be doing one or always be doing the other. But if your principle is to say, over time, I want to be furthering my own personal purpose or the company's purpose or whatever the purpose is of the institution that you're in, I think you can't go far wrong with that.
And people come alive.
Yes, that's when you get the most creativity and usually the best results.
It sounds fantastic. You wrote about learning to practice kindness and humility, constantly challenging the status quo and have deep learning conversations. So when you came back to work after that training, did you start doing something differently? Did you give yourself permission to explore the more human leader in you?
I think what I realized is that I am at my most curious and creative and open when I am operating more in that way of connecting in a more human way. And so I just, yes, I suppose you're right, I gave myself permission to do that. Tried to stay in that mode of curiosity, deep listening, because I could really see that was a way of projecting my best self into the situation, but also I could see that it tended to garner a positive response in other people as well. So I think I definitely did do things differently, but weirdly it was more about just being myself, so it was almost easier than it had been before. It wasn't hard.
And it's always easier just to be ourselves.
Yeah.
Well, but you talked about deep listening. What's a deep learning conversation, and how different is it from a regular conversation?
I think we grow up with that sense of, I've got to be right, I've got to know what I'm talking about. And this is a permission almost to say it's absolutely fine to go into a conversation not knowing anything about the topic in particular, but having a deep curiosity. And when you do that, you find that you listen to other people on a different level. You've almost got nothing to lose because you've come in with not much knowledge about whatever it is that you're talking about. I think actually the first step is the hardest, which is to seek out people that you know think differently from you. That we are so trained and ingrained to seek out people like us in life, in work, is that sort of affirmation of our own ideas, because it feels good, to think, okay, I was right.
And it's not going to challenge you.
Yes, exactly. So I always think that if you can get over that first step, which is to say, I know that Penny is going to feel completely differently on this subject from me. I'm going to actively go out and listen to her view and not try to convince her of my own. That's the first step. And I think once you get past that, it's actually quite good fun.
It sounds like you enjoy it. You mentioned earlier before we started recording your interest in numbers and how data is linked to your belief in honesty. Can you unpack that for me? I mean, how are those connected?
Well, I suppose I feel that numbers are less likely to be manipulated than words, maybe wrongly, but I think I've always had a love of numbers. I've always been, I suppose that's what led me into science and even now into data analytics and AI. But I also think as well that data is a great friend to anyone making difficult decisions. It's very easy for us to be influenced by opinions, stories, folklore. It's always important to me, I think, to get the actual data, because although numbers can be manipulated, so often the numbers tell actually a very simple story and make decisions a lot easier than they would otherwise be.
Well, how do you use data to have conversations with your team? You mentioned storytelling.
I work in an organisation where many of us are scientists and engineers, so data is a common language, and it helps in a number of ways. I think it can bring understanding and clarity to decisions. It tends to be a sort of a universal language that we can all understand. And it's also a way of, I think, circumventing more difficult discussions about how things are going, because if we focus on the numbers, in a way it becomes a little bit less personal. So, okay, let's see what the numbers are telling us. And that can help, I think, make it feel a little bit more like we're in this together. How do we solve this? How do we move these numbers? So I find that it can unlock difficult situations to focus on the numbers rather than the words a lot of the time.
So you're armed with this new leadership philosophy. You got kindness, you got purpose, data-driven honesty. So what did you do with that? I mean, you made a very unusual move for someone on a technical track. You went from being a scientist to leading digital innovation. But there was an interesting stop in between. You spent time at Infineum as a global HR director. So that's a little bit unusual. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I owe that absolutely 100% to my boss at the time, a very gifted leader who saw that would be a great addition to my armory, I suppose. And it seemed a little bit odd to me at the time as well, but I'm so glad that I listened to him, because very simply, if you are a leader of any kind of organization, you need to know how to run the business and run the company. And up until that point, all my experience had been about running the business. So developing products, understanding customers, thinking about operations. But actually a company is made up of people and policies and processes, and the success of an organization is really down to how those people interact together, how they interact with your stakeholders and customers, how they grow individually and collectively, and how they perform. So the experience of leading HR really opened my eyes to how important that is. You often hear people say, you know, the success of this organization is completely down to the people. And it sounds a little bit of a cliche, but that time in HR told me that is absolutely true. And if you don't look after the people in your organization, the business will start to suffer as well. So you must do both. And so that was a phenomenal experience. And I always say that if I were ever to write a book about any part of my career, it would be that piece, because it was actually in many ways the most interesting and the most exciting.
That's brilliant. So what you had to choose one thing, what would it be about that role as global HR director that you come back to and think, yeah, that's spot on?
What I learned in that role is how different people's motivations are, and it is futile to assume that everybody needs the same thing, everybody wants to achieve the same thing, everybody's motivated in the same way. And because I was able to see individual examples of this playing out in various different scenarios, I really learned that actually as a leader, investing time in understanding what motivates people in different cultures, from different backgrounds, at different parts of their career, what is going to unlock people's capability, what is going to make them fearful. The diversity of how people perform is incredible, and that was my big takeaway from that role.
That sounds amazing. Are you thinking of a particular person? Can you give us an example of how you found out about someone's motivations that might have surprised you?
Well, one of the things you also learn in HR is that everything is secret and the book is closed.
So well, don't give us any names.
Yeah. But I think, you know, as you can imagine, you come across all sorts of examples. People who are incredibly talented and you don't want them to leave the organization. People who are struggling for perhaps a personal reason and you need to give some particular help to. People who are frustrated and want to understand more about why they're not achieving certain things. And yeah, without naming names or giving specific examples, it was really that understanding that, gosh, I was one individual I've worked with for a long time, and I never realized what the background to their situation was and how much it influenced the way that they performed and behaved at work. The more you can know your colleagues deeply and appreciate really what makes them tick, I suppose, the more likely you are to be able to get the most out of everybody around you and yourself, actually.
I wanted to also ask you about how you feel about having that deep background in material science. Now you're in C-suite. What's one specific skill or way of thinking that you learned in the lab that you might still rely on?
Well, actually, I always say, it's a great question, because I always say that actually most people's PhDs, what they study is of not much use later on in life. I mean, I studied layered ceramic materials for high temperature gas engines. I've not typically needed that much in the last 30 years. But what you learn is the concept of understanding a problem deeply, creating a hypothesis for what might be the solution to that problem, and then rigorously testing it and understanding which data is relevant and which data is not relevant, and how to draw conclusions that are robust. And that is something that I have used many, many times in all sorts of situations. How can you think through the problem you are trying to solve, what is already known about it, what is your solution and why is it different, and how can you test it out in a sort of a relatively low risk way to find out whether it's worth implementing and changing things. I think that philosophy has been really useful.
It sounds like I can hear how much that matters to you in your voice. So most people have no idea what a CTO or an EVP of digital innovation actually does all day. Walk me through one of your typical days. What does CTO mean, for example?
Well, I essentially lead two parts of the organisation that I work for. We're a specialty chemicals company, so we are making products which deliver performance in particular in vehicles, actually, because a lot of what we do is transportation additives for cars, trucks, ships, or anything that moves, pretty much. So there's two elements to what I do. One is really thinking how will the world evolve? What are the products that are needed in the future? How should we manage our investment in research so that we are creating the things that make a difference to people 5 years from now? That's a set of choices. So most of what I'm doing is making choices a lot of the time. That's how I describe my role to my children as well, is there's typically never a right answer, but do you invest more here or there? Do you try something, and how long do you try it for before you say, actually, I don't think that's working, we'd be better off pulling that investment and putting it somewhere else? How much do you prioritize the short term over the long term? So a lot of what I'm doing is making those sorts of decisions, but deeply listening to the input from others, because I don't know the answers. It's more about the process of listening to the different options and making the choice, which is the part that I do. And then I would say that on the digital side, last week I was making a presentation to our board of directors about our AI strategy for the future, which was very exciting. So again, it comes down to where are we going to invest? How fast are we going to move? What are we committing to deliver? How is that going? So those are some of the questions that I'm asking myself on a daily basis, and generally listening to a lot of people to understand the context, and then helping make the decision about what to do and creating a clear path for others then to implement, moving obstacles out of the way, or trying to anyway.
So a typical day would be meetings, presentations?
Meetings, that could be one-to-one meetings, video calls, yes, presentations, so still reviewing slides, more and more relying on AI to help generate content.
And tell us more about that. AI is such
Well,
a big thing now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think there's I think the latest count was about 800 million users worldwide of ChatGPT now. So it's obviously something that lots of people are experimenting with, but it's a huge help to people in roles like the one I have, because it just makes it so much easier to find information than we could do before, and do it in a conversational way. So literally talking to the AI or typing and having a conversation, tell me about this. So I use it a lot now to prepare myself for conversations with other people.
That's a brilliant way to use it. We were just talking before recording about using it to learn a language.
Yes,
Speak in Spanish.
Yeah.
For example.
Yeah, so
you can use it in your work.
In my work, yeah. So most of my time, as you said, is spent in meetings, listening, then making decisions.
And you've moved through scientist, HR director, now digital innovation, roles that aren't obvious progressions. How do you think about advocating for yourself? I mean, what's your approach to creating the career that you want?
That is a good question. I've always focused more on doing the best job that I can do and learning about things that I'm interested in, and so far that has largely guided where I've ended up and what I do. I would say I don't have so much of an idea of wanting to be a particular thing or have a particular role. What really drives me is the opportunity to learn and improve, and so that's what I have sought out, which is a little bit of why I've jumped around so much. Had the experience of working abroad as well earlier in my career. I'm sort of constantly seeking those opportunities to expand my understanding and knowledge of people and technology.
It's your curiosity. So you've been given these opportunities to just learn new things and improve, and also just I think being able to be yourself, authentically doing that.
Yes. So, you asked me about how do I advocate for myself. I don't feel that I have perhaps spent a lot of time doing that. Rather, I've been thinking, where can I find the opportunity to stretch myself a little bit more and be involved in things that I really enjoy doing.
That's what it comes down to, I think. I wanted to ask you about, what's the hardest thing you've ever had to ask for?
Gosh, that's a good question. Well, I think one of the hardest conversations I've had was when I told my boss at the time that I was pregnant for the third time, because I was in an executive role by then, and I was pretty sure that I was the first person who would ever have gone on maternity leave in that kind of role. So it was a bit unprecedented, and I didn't know how, and it was actually the only time in my life where I've been reporting to another woman, actually, so it was quite fortuitous. But I really didn't know how she was going to react, and I felt guilty about being in a big role, having a number of people in the team and asking to have the time off. I shouldn't have worried about it. I'm very lucky to work for a fabulous organisation that supports parents and particularly mothers, and everything worked out very, very smoothly. But that was probably one of the things that I agonized over the most.
Just because of the particular role that you were in, and that you were one of the first to ask for maternity leave.
in that kind
in
of
that
job.
kind of a role.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's incredible.
I
I'm
think,
glad to
yeah.
hear that it worked out.
It really did, and I, you know, I think that makes such a difference in an organisation when leaders and the whole culture supports people to have families and work at the same time. So I was very,
Absolutely.
very fortunate.
So in 2023, you won that prestigious Kindness and Leadership Award. And you said in the short clip, which I saw caught my attention when you were interviewed, that winning it made you feel emboldened to continue down, you know, that kindness path. So what did you mean by that word? It's such a great word.
I think it goes back to the sort of the revelation 10 years earlier that there was a different way of leading that could be equally as effective as the I guess the example that I had seen more commonly up until that point. And even though I had had that revelation and you start to practice it, the reality is we continue to see, I would say, more examples of the strong, resilient, slightly cool way of leading. So there are moments in life where you have doubts about, or I have had doubts about, is it still okay to practice this more, I suppose, human leadership concept. And what I meant by that is that winning an award for kindness in leadership was just another boost. It was like another kind of burst of air into my balloon to say, keep going.
Exactly. Just keep going. I mean, winning that award, what did it mean to you, winning that award?
It's very special. It's very special. But the most special part is when you look round and you look at the other people who've won it.
What do you mean?
Well, when I turned up to the awards ceremony and you meet people who are doing amazing things in public service, have set up charities, who are championing incredible causes, that makes you feel special to be part of a group like that. We tend to sort of only know what we're doing, and to be part of a group where you feel so much admiration for the others, that was the most special part of it for me.
You were on the right track with the way you were leading.
Well, yeah, or you feel quite humbled to be in the same cadre as people like that. So yeah, and it does. It makes you feel you're not alone, which we're definitely not, and to keep going, and that it's worth it, and people appreciate it.
Who were the people, men and women, who championed you over the years? Not just mentors, but actual sponsors who opened doors, perhaps. I mean, what did they do that made the difference?
I would say I owe so much probably to three men in my life. One would be my dad, who I think very much championed the concept of science. He encouraged me to think about the PhD. And these were all things that I didn't really have other role models in my family of doing some of these things. So he was a very strong advocate for me growing up, and was always happy to talk about my work, which not many people are. So you know, I owe a lot to him, and he was, I would say, he was my cheerleader all the time.
I love that.
And then I mentioned the leader I had who took me into HR. I feel like he always had my back somewhere, even though I wasn't always working for him in Infineum, but he always seemed to be in the background somewhere, taking care of me. And I didn't always know that at the time, but it became more obvious later on. And I realised that many of the opportunities that I had were orchestrated by him. So I feel very much indebted to him as well. And things like that HR role are a classic example of where I think he knew something that would be good for me that I didn't know myself, and took the time to make that happen. So I owe him a lot. And then, of course, I have to mention my husband. None of this would be possible without the love and support that I have from him. And I always feel that he's like a sort of human flotation device for me. There are times when it all feels a little bit too much, and you have that sense of I might be going under here. But he is just a constant source of flotation and lifting me up, and I couldn't do what I do without him.
What did they see in you that you might not have seen in yourself?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is I think it's important, we're here talking about women, but actually the men in our lives are so important, and they can often, I think, help us succeed where we might not otherwise be able to do that ourselves. So very important shout out for the men here as well. I think that all of them have seen a strength in me that I didn't always know was there myself, and a combination of skills I think that they recognised as being more unusual than I realised. And what I mean by that is you only know what you know, and what you do seems normal to you. But I think they recognised a combination of strength and determination with curiosity, but with a human element that could be more powerful than I realised it could be.
It's a great combination.
But you'd probably have to ask them to see if that's right or not. But yes, I think we all need that, because you never. We tend to be more critical of ourselves than others are. So, but they've given me their fair share of feedback as well on how to improve. So, which everybody needs to.
Exactly. Everything in your profile defies that mold that you talked about. 5'1", a scientist who led HR. Now you're an executive vice president. So, yeah, a mother of 3 as well. So, can you tell us why that's even important for you to mention that you have a family?
I went for a job interview once. So even though I have stayed at Infineum for 25 years, I will confess now that I have actually interviewed for other roles at various points. And I was struck by how the 2 people interviewing me introduced themselves. So again, I've grown up in a very corporate environment. We always tend to introduce ourselves in the same way. Hello, I am so-and-so. I've been here for X number of years. I do this role, all very sort of factual. And a few years ago, I went for a job interview, and the 2 people interviewing me, who are very senior people, started with, hello, I am so-and-so, I've got 4 children and 2 horses, and then went into, this is the role that I do. And I was so struck by it, because it immediately put me at ease, and it immediately made me feel like they were just human people, just like me. And I thought, how lovely to know a little bit of your life, who you are, not just what you do. And so I just sort of made a pact with myself that day. I'm going to do that as well. And so that's why in my bio it says that I am a mother of 3 children, as well as being an EVP.
And you should have put a little bit about your dog there, because Theo is just adorable. I know it means a lot to you. It's on your profile background on LinkedIn. Yes, yeah. But I think a lot of people can relate to that. But I'm wondering, what's the hardest part about being a senior leader and a mother? Could you give me a specific moment when the 2 roles collided?
Yeah, I think the hardest thing is not always being there in the difficult moments. I do travel a little bit with my job, And with time differences and things, it sometimes means that I can go for several days without speaking to the children. And there have been a couple of times when I've come home and realised that something has happened. They've experienced something while I've been away, and I haven't been there to help.
That sounds hard.
It is hard, and I think in those moments you have to give yourself a little bit of a break and say, you know, what opportunities am I creating for them by doing what I'm doing? What example am I setting? And you know, you have to take the rough with the smooth a little bit. But in general, it is that sense of not being there for them when they need you. And I was given a great piece of advice by one of those male allies that I mentioned, which I would give to others as well, which is, whatever you're doing, be present in that thing. So if you're at work, be at work. Don't check your phone and try to, you know, do your kind of grocery order at the same time or whatever. But equally, when you're with your children, be present in that moment. Give them 100% of your attention. Don't sit there at the kind of carol concert, you know, checking your emails at the same time. And it was a great piece of advice. It recognises you've got two roles in life. As long as you're always present and doing your best in whichever one you're doing at the time, that's all that you can do. And that probably means more than spending more time with the children, but being less present while you're doing it.
So just give them 100% of your attention. Because they know when you're not doing that anyway.
They do. We all know that. We've all been on the phone with someone that we know is actually reading the internet while they're talking to you.
That's brilliant advice. Could you share a specific moment when someone completely perhaps underestimated you because of your size or your gender or both, and how maybe you used that to your advantage? What happened?
I feel like I've actually been very lucky in all my working career. I've never felt excluded or underestimated because of my gender or even my size. I think what I have found more difficult is the sense of not always being part of conversations that are more designed, you know, or men seem to be more comfortable having. So what I noticed early on in my career is when I would go to meetings, a lot of the conversation would be about football to start with. And I don't really watch football. Well, I do now, thanks to my son,
yes.
But I didn't at the time. And or golf. And there are certain topics that I often felt excluded from. I had a choice, though. I had a choice whether to join in or to bring my own topics to the table, and I decided to do the latter instead. I just couldn't bring myself to start playing golf. So you know, that's, I guess, a moment where there's no point in feeling sorry for yourself in those moments. You've got a choice then. You can own your difference and treat it as an asset, or you can feel, you know, the victim. And that was some advice I was given once, and I think it's very valuable. Is don't sit there and feel bad about being different. Own it and try to use it as a strength. Bring something new to the table that wouldn't be there if you weren't there.
I love that. And you know, we've talked about you not fitting that traditional executive profile or mold, as you said, and I think you've really figured out how to lead authentically. So, what's your advice for women who are trying to do the same?
I think it's so important to be yourself, and to be yourself, you've got to invest time in knowing who you are.
Starting
it sounds
from there.
odd, but it took me almost 15 to 20 years to go through a process of really exploring who I am and what is important to me. And I spent some time asking myself a series of questions and helped by a coach at the time. And I sort of came up with what I would call my core values. What are the things that if somebody asked me not to do those things, I would say, I'm sorry, I can't do that. You've mentioned some of them already, you know, transparency is one of them. I would say another one is I like to have fun. You know, you mentioned the kind of the crazy glasses post on LinkedIn.
That's brilliant.
If you asked me to do my job and not have fun, that would be a sort of a red line for me. So I found it so helpful to explore what is the basis of who I am and how does that influence all the decisions that I make. When you understand that about yourself, you deeply understand what strengths that gives you, but you also understand the weaknesses and the vulnerabilities that it gives you. It then allows you, it's almost a permission then to be who you are because you're doing it consciously rather than unconsciously. That is one of the most valuable exercises I've ever done, and I think it unlocks this ability to lead in an authentic way because you actually know deeply who you are, good and bad.
And what matters to you
And
most.
what matters, yeah.
So if you can go back to 25-year-old Rebecca, the research scientist just started her career, what would you tell her?
What I would tell my younger self is spend more time building resilience and less time pursuing perfection.
Tell me more.
I think at that age, almost everything you've done has been geared towards getting the best grades, doing your very best all of the time, and working largely on an individual basis. And what I know now in life is that often good enough is fine. Perfection is rarely required. And learning to deal with setbacks and learning to operate with others and expand your own capability through the people around you are the real routes to success. But we don't tend to learn that as we're growing up through school and university. So yeah, I would definitely tell myself, look to make more mistakes, look for mistakes, look for opportunities to learn, talk to more people who are different than you are, and build resilience as a result, and stop worrying about being perfect.
And do that deep listening too.
Yes.
While you're talking to all those people.
Yeah.
What's the biggest barrier to women's advancement that people perhaps don't talk enough about?
Well, I'm sure there's many answers to that question, but let me share my experience of that. I feel that if we could crack the dilemma of how do women work and care for their families and dependents at the same time, in a very practical way, I think we could unlock a lot of advancement that is left on the table for women today. And what I mean by that is, I think it's just a fact that if you go and stand at the school gates, or if you talk to women who've come out of university and early careers, many of the people who are at home looking after children or even other dependents are women. That's a fact. It's very hard to do that and work at the same time. Some people achieve it, and kudos to them. But it's simply an artifact of the way that we do work and how we organise ourselves. And I've seen many very, very smart, talented women need to either go to part-time work, which is actually perhaps a good compromise, but many have actually stopped working altogether because they feel that they're needed at home more than at work. I'd love to find a solution to that and a way that people can organise themselves, be part of the community at work, and find a different way of caring for their families and dependents that allows them to do both. I think that until we achieve that, we're always going to leave female talents at the door.
And that is a shame. You co-authored a chapter on inclusive thinking in a leadership book called Mastering the Power of You, and of course donated the royalties to Oxfam. What does inclusive thinking actually look like in practice? Talking again about those women that we're not really being inclusive if we're not helping them get to the office if they have caring responsibilities. So could you give us an example of what inclusive thinking looks like?
I think in general, I would say that it's really about extending your network right to the fringes. So in whatever context you're thinking about, whether it's you're trying to solve a problem, who are you talking to about that problem, whether you're thinking about filling a role, who are you considering for that role, whether you're thinking about how to set up a new part of your organization or a strategy, how bold are you being with that? I think for me, inclusive thinking really comes down to pushing the boundaries of your network and extending it out almost beyond where you think it should go. And I think if you start from that lens, it helps you to take any situation like the one that you mentioned of how do we help women advance, how do we solve problems faster, how do we find the right solutions for the world. All of those things are aided by a concept of extend your network beyond where you think it should be.
Okay, and talking about extending and pushing boundaries, Rebecca, what's next for you? I mean, where do you want to be in 5 years from now?
Still learning.
Of course.
that's the
always
most
has to be a
important
part
thing
of it.
to me. Yeah, I'm very excited about deploying AI in research and innovation. I see a lot of opportunity for us to unleash the creativity of our great scientists and entrepreneurs. There's a lot of tasks that need to be done in life, and it's as true in research and development as anywhere else. And that takes our time away from really being creative, working together, solving problems. So I do see a big opportunity for AI there, and I would like to look back in 5 years and think that we had deployed AI in a way that allows us to solve problems faster and more effectively than we do today.
That sounds exciting. And you did shared with me that you did do a little bit of AI training recently. How will that help you?
Well, it's definitely helped me in 2 ways. First of all, I think I now understand the opportunities better, but I also have a very grounded understanding of the risks as well. And I think that's always important. You gotta know what you're dealing with. You've got to know the beast that you're tackling. So there's plenty of challenges in implementing AI as well. I think my biggest takeaway from that is really to think about how to use it to amplify the value that you can create, not just take something away. And again, it's a bit like that sort of curious thinking rather than closing your thinking down. So I also wrote my first or developed my first app during this training course, which sounds a lot more difficult than it actually is, because now, of course, you can just ask AI to do it for you. So yeah. So
what does the app do?
Oh, it was an app to play blackjack. So it was a game.
That's very cool.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's a fascinating subject, and one that I don't think will go away. I think AI will become part of all of our lives, and there is definitely the opportunity for that to be positive. So I'm hoping to be part of that.
So tell me, Rebecca, what's a leadership myth that you'd like to bust?
That leaders know everything. I think there's a sense that people look to leaders, and leaders feel a need to know all the answers. I think the more all of us can look at leaders as people who actively seek out knowledge from others, put their context with it, and make the best possible decisions as a result, I think that's a better recipe for success. So that's the leadership myth I would try to bust.
And this podcast is called Women Leaders, Tales, Trails, and Truths. We've covered your tale, that great negotiation video moment where you discovered your strength. We've covered your trail, the 25-year journey from scientist to C-suite, through HR, through motherhood and learning to lead with kindness. What's the truth that you want women listening to take away after our conversation today?
I think the truth is that all of this is powered by gratitude. If I could give one piece of advice to anyone, actually, not just women, when you feel grateful for what you have and who you are, grateful to be a woman, you find yourself in a state where you've got nothing to lose by pursuing more. And it creates a power and a curiosity and a calmness and a strength that I think can propel you to the next thing. If conversely, you're always feeling like you haven't quite done enough and that you'll only be satisfied if there's more, you've got too much to lose to go for it sometimes. So I have found that the truth to unlocking our potential is about feeling deeply grateful for what you have now and the experiences that you've had and what you've already brought to the world. Because if you feel like that, when you're in that mindset, you might as well go for more. You've got nothing to lose.
Wow. I'm so grateful for this conversation. I've learned loads. We really want to thank you for your time and sharing all of that wisdom and your insights. A conversation I won't easily forget. So thank you so much, Rebecca.
Thank you, Penny. Thank you for having me.